Welcome to the fantastic world of Hanna and Barbera, a celebration of Bill Hanna, Joe Barbera, and the thousands of people past and present who have shared in their entertainment tradition. Here we go! And now your host, Greg Ehrbar.
Thank you, Chris Anthony. Welcome to the fantastic world of Hanna and Barbera. I am Greg Ehrbar, author of Hanna Barbera, The Recorded History, now on audio, as well as ebook and book. We have one of the actual executives who had a major role participating in the Taft Hanna Barbera partnership. And it really was a partnership. It wasn't so much an acquisition. His name is Charles Mechem. First, I just want to welcome you to the show, Charles.
My pleasure, and call me Charlie. That's what most people call me. My mother was the only person ever to call me Charles. I am almost 95 years old, but my mind, I think, is reasonably accurate, and I'll certainly hope to contribute to your work because I loved Bill and Joe and everything about them. I should be clear about this, too. I was a lawyer for the company when we acquired, we meaning Taft Broadcasting, when we acquired Hanna Barbera. I was a young lawyer representing Taft Broadcasting, but a year later, the founder and chairman of Taft was killed in a bizarre, tragic accident, and I was asked to become a chairman and CEO, which I did in 1967. Mm-hmm. So I went from a company lawyer to the CEO.
Wow. Yeah, and that was a bizarre thing. It was like some sort of a gas explosion in his house.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting sidelight. Those were the days when people were concerned about the Russians lobbing missiles in from Cuba. So anybody that had any nose for flying, and Hubert Taft Jr. did, many of these people built bomb shelters on their property. And Hub, everybody called him Hub, Hub built a bomb shelter on his estate, and one night he came home, and nobody knows what happened, but a gas leak, the bomb shelter blew up, and he was killed in that. So he had no plan for succession. And after, I don't know, maybe a month, the Taft and Ingalls families were the major stockholders, and they asked me to step in as CEO, which I did, and I wasn't sure if I could do it, and I was there 26 years.
Now, the Hanna-Barbera acquisition had already taken place in December of 66, correct?
Right.
Taft originally was broadcasting and owned lots of stations in the country, and I guess that at the time there was only so much that it could have station-wise, and so instead of Hanna-Barbera going public, it was privately sold. But there were other bidders, including Columbia.
Yes, and as a little bit of background, Lloyd Taft, who was one of the family members, was working then, I don't know if he's a partner or not, but he might have been, at Loeb Roach, then investment banker. Lloyd called and told us that Hanna-Barbera was looking to be sold, and he thought that we might like to own it. And, of course, we jumped at it. But that came about just straight from Lloyd Taft, and we made the deal. It was a stock deal.
From what I've read, it was 14, and because Columbia would only go as high as 12, they could kick themselves later because Charles Fries, there's a YouTube video with him interviewed, and you can hear him say, we tried to get an equivalent studio from then on, and we just couldn't do it. And a few years later, along comes Scooby-Doo, in addition to all the other assets, and it really was a wise but a risky move, too.
Yeah, of course. I got to know Lou Wasserman pretty well because Universal wanted to buy Hanna-Barbera from us. And every time I'd go to L.A., he'd call and say, hey, come on over and let's talk. But we never even remotely contemplated selling Hanna-Barbera.
I remember at some point Michael Eisner, when he was at Disney, was considering it, too.
Yeah. Yep.
In writing the book, I saw so many parallels between Disney and Hanna Barbera in that their first programs are considered sort of the crown jewels. Just like Walt Disney's first several films, no matter how many wonderful ones came later, are still sort of the foundation and could never be replicated fully because of the talent and the resources and the times. So same thing with Hanna Barbera. Those first syndicated shows and then the 4 primetime shows were way over budget. That's why they were so good.
That's, of course. Joe didn't spend a lot of time worrying about budget. Bill did.
Yeah, so they way overspent. I think Johnny Quest was the most expensive. And from what I'm gathering, the last thing they did that was screen gems was Alice in Wonderland, or What's a Nice Kid Like You Doing in a Place Like This. And then after the sale, there was sort of a gap period because of Hub's death and, reshuffling, figuring out what to do. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the budgetary issues had to be addressed because then they went into the superhero thing, and then Huckleberry Finn, which we talked about in an earlier show, which was a massively expensive show.
Yep.
And Jack and the Beanstalk, too. And so even though Hanna and Barbera had developed economic ways of doing this, they still needed to reformulate their processes, right?
True. Absolutely.
So when you first were involved, were you at the very first board meeting on Bill Hanna's yacht?
I was. Hub Taft and I.
Did he make you his famous trout dish or what?
Anything that Bill fixed was delicious. Put it that way. And Bud Rogers might have been in that meeting. I just don't recall.
Bud Rogers, is that Lawrence Rogers who wrote the book?
Yes.
The article of which is in the book Hanna and Barbera Conversations by Tyler Solon Williams and Kevin Sandler, which is also published by University Press of Mississippi, end of commercial. But there's even more to the story than that. What happened at the meeting and its subsequent things to get everybody on board with the purchase?
Everybody was on board with the purchase. Everybody was excited about it. There was no issue at all of that. There was the issue of who would succeed Hub Taft, and as I mentioned earlier, to my shock and horror, they picked me, and I wasn't sure I could do it, but I did.
Mm-hmm. But you were operating still out of Cincinnati.
Yes.
Okay, so when this happened, and I asked you this before the show, just for the record, as they say, for the record, Hanna Barbera had a short-lived record company, which is sort of at the heart of my book, and there are those who would say, well, maybe that was why it folded. It had nothing to do with Taft, and you weren't even aware they had a record company.
I knew that Jess Morgan, that name familiar to you?
Yeah, he's mentioned in Lawrence Rogers' article.
He and I became very close friends, and I think he sort of moved them out of. Taft never really got involved in the records.
That ended in sometime in '67, and the whole thing hadn't quite gone. From this article, it also said that Taft wasn't just acquiring to acquire, and not just a holding company, but a participating operation company. How did Taft become involved with the creative and the production at Hanna Barbera?
Well, I don't think we were brazen enough to be creative. We encouraged Bill and Joe to keep doing what they were doing and to do even more. We loved those guys, and I think they come to really respect and care for us. It was as easy a transition, an acquisition. I made many acquisitions as a lawyer. This was the easiest one ever.
The acquisition of one company by another is more common now than ever. In your case, they did have to look at their budgets, but you kept the creative and the production people in charge of, like you said, what they did best. Not always the case in acquisitions.
Well, I was with a law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister in Cincinnati, and I specialized in acquisitions. So I saw a lot of them. Many acquisitions came a cropper because the acquiring company tried to take it over and not let the people who had done so well keep doing it. And so we tried to learn from that. I tried to learn from that as a young lawyer.
Yeah, and Hanna-Barbera had a history and a heritage, and you not only respected that, but you also expanded upon it because the reach of the cartoons and the merchandise became more worldwide.
Yes, and of course we used Hanna-Barbera as a springboard basically for our amusement park operations, which became a very big part of our business. We ended up, I think, with 5 major parks, the biggest of which was Canada's Wonderland. And Hanna-Barbera was the motivator for the theme park business.
You also mentioned before we began that you had a meeting with Roy Disney about theme parks.
This is one of the most amazing stories in my career. There was a law firm in L.A. that represented Hanna-Barbera, and I think Disney as well. Youngman, Hungate, and Leopold. And the senior partner was called Tubby Youngman. He wasn't Tubby, but he had been one time before I knew him, I guess. And I called Tubby and said, do you know anyone who could arrange a meeting for me with Roy Disney? Walt, of course, passed away then. And he said, I can. So he set up this meeting with Roy. I figured I'd get about a half an hour. I was with him for over 3 hours. And I think he really enjoyed my reaching out to him to find out how we ought to get into the amusement park business. And so we had a delightful visit. And as I was leaving, I said, Mr. Disney, I certainly thank you for your help. Have I left out anything? And he kind of laughed and he said, you know, it's funny that you'd be here talking to me about amusement parks because you have the finest small amusement park in the United States in Cincinnati, Coney Island.
Uh-huh.
This is the Coney Island in Cincinnati, not New York. He said, what you should do, he didn't say it in a dictatorial way, just a helpful way. He said, what you should do is you should buy Coney Island in Cincinnati and use that as a springboard, the management and so forth, to get into the amusement park business. Now, here's the ironic part. The senior partner in the law firm that I had been with for about 10 years was the major stockholder of Coney Island in Cincinnati. His name was Charles Sawyer, quite a distinguished gentleman. He'd been Secretary of Commerce under Truman and so on. So I went to see Mr. Sawyer and I said, would you consider selling Coney Island to Taft Broadcasting? It'll be a stock deal. He loved it. And so that happened. But think of the confluence of things that occurred at that time, with him being the major stockholder in Coney Island.
And according to Dennis Spiegel, who was on an earlier podcast, Roy and Walt, when they were traveling the world to see the best in theme parks before Disneyland, the Coney Island Park was one of the ones that they visited and were impressed by with its cleanliness and its staffing.
That's exactly what Mr. Disney told me, and that gave me a lot of encouragement. And so we did acquire Coney Island, importantly because Charles Sawyer was the major stockholder, and we used the management of Coney Island for the theme parks and went from there. It was one of those situations where everything fell into place. It could have gone off the rail more than once, but it didn't.
In the case of Coney Island, the park existed before, and I guess it was on the river, and that's one of the reasons it was moved to Kings Mills.
Yes, because it flooded every spring.
Ooh.
That was not only a nuisance, but expensive and time-consuming. So they really were anxious to move. And, of course, the Watch family, who were the operators, very much wanted to build a major theme park, and we gave them that opportunity.
I think I asked Dennis this as well. Why was the Eiffel Tower chosen as the icon?
That was principally done by Gary Watts, who was the operating head of Coney, and it was just this simple. He knew, and I agreed with him completely, that we needed something big and recognizable. And what's big and recognizable anymore than the Eiffel Tower in the middle of corn country in southern Ohio?
Yeah, and you can still ride up to the top, right?
Oh, yeah. In fact, that's where I stood on opening day. And I remember vividly thinking, suppose nobody comes. Interestingly enough, nobody did come until about the 4th of July. And I think it was pretty simple. As I talked to people, they said, oh, no, there'll be huge crowds, and we don't want to get caught. We'll wait until the 4th of July, and then we'll... And, of course, nobody did come. And I was getting a little nervous. But then on the 4th of July, it was like somebody unleashed the lions. People came in droves. So I relaxed.
When Walt Disney World was being built and planned, the presence of Walt Disney at the New York World's Fair at 6465, one of the reasons that happened was they weren't totally sure that the East Coast would go for Disney attractions.
Yeah.
And it ends up that Walt Disney World is like Disney. It's mammoth. It's a city in itself.
This is interesting. I think one day the treasurer of our company, Dot Murphy, Dot came into my office and closed the door, and she said, Charlie, we're out of money. And I said, what? She said, we don't have enough money to finish the park, Kings Island. So what we did is we went out and made a couple of deals for a couple of pieces of the park. I think a restaurant and a pizza place. We sold those off to third parties, and we had enough money to finish the park.
And the pizza place is legendary now.
It is. It was the most popular pizza place in all of southern Ohio. We lucked out, but I had a heart attack almost when she said, we don't have any money.
Well, one of the other things that was developed there were seasonal events throughout the year, which brought in people.
Definitely. And we actually, at one point, stayed open. Maybe they still do. I don't know, at Christmas time.
Yeah, we had Andrea Canny, who's both a Kings Island and a Disney stage performer, and she was there last year for the Winterfest and sang in the contemporary choir. She was the first belle in Walt Disney World before they even had a Broadway show, Beauty and the Beast, and she learned everything, all of the disciplines and things about performing, really because Kings Island Productions was a benchmark for a lot of performers.
We had a great guide, and Jack Rouse is in charge of all of our live shows, and he made a career out of it. He was very good.
Let's talk about the Happy Land of Hanna Barbera, and the signature ride was the Enchanted Voyage.
Yes, a dark ride.
Did Bill and Joe participate in the design and the sketching and the...
Actively,
Yeah?
Yes. Very actively. Who would be dumb enough to build something like that in the Happy Land of Hanna Barbera and not have them involved? So they were very involved.
Were they out there a lot, seeing the construction and at the event?
Not a lot, but enough. You know, they had to come all the way from L.A., so I didn't try to lean on them, but they wanted it to be right.
So everything that was built there had their personal involvement and stamp.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then after Enchanted Voyage, it became the Smurf ride.
Right.
Can I also, I know I asked Dennis, for those of you who've listened to all the episodes, but I love talking about this.
Okay.
Do you have any stories behind when the Partridge Family and the Brady Bunch did their shows there?
Well, you got to remember, Cincinnati is sort of remote from showbiz, and when they came to the park, people went bananas. They loved it, and the people loved them. So those were important things for us. In fact, at the opening of the park, Earl Wilson, does that name mean anything to you?
Oh, he was a columnist, yeah.
Yeah, he was a guest of the park when we opened.
Wow, so he must have given it a nice write-up.
Oh, he did, and we knew he would. So one of my employees was a good friend of his, and so he arranged it all.
For those of you who want to see who Earl Wilson was, he was a very renowned columnist. He has a cameo, I think, in Beach Blanket Bingo, one of the Beach Party movies, and his phrase was, "That's Earl, brother."
He was big. He was really big. So having him there as our guest was very helpful to us.
And so it became not only one of the most popular parks in the country and especially in the region, but also a destination for people who love roller coasters.
Including me. I've always loved roller coasters. And the Wall Street Journal did a column on me, and it ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And to my mixed delight and horror, I was described as a roller coaster nut. And I thought, I always wanted to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but not as a roller coaster nut. But I was. And you may or may not know this, but Canada's Wonderland now is drawing 4 million people a year.
Today, wow.
Beyond belief. And one of the smartest things we ever did, I mean my colleagues who work with me, we were able at that point to buy 200 acres of land just north of Toronto. Can you imagine what that would cost today if you could even do it?
Yeah.
So
then there's Canada's Wonderland, King's Dominion in Virginia, which Dale Moore, the designer, he was on an earlier program. He did a lot of creative for it, including Yogi's Cave. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Then we owned Carowinds in Carolina.
Oh, very renowned park, yeah. And the one in Australia.
The only one that didn't work.
Oh, really? What's the story of that? I mean, that's interesting.
There is no story. We could never, I guess it was just so alien. Somebody said, the Aussies are busy with their Sunday cookouts. Anyway, it wasn't a failure so much as it wasn't strong enough to continue to invest.
Mm-hmm. Well, like the characters of Hanna Barbera are known there. I mean, that's another guess.
Yes.
But the concept of a theme park, I guess, has looked at differently.
Just kind of far away.
Yeah. Let's talk about the rest of your career. I mean, all of these parks, perhaps except that one, thrived under your watch, and then Taft became sort of an empire into itself.
We did, and we began expanding the company in a lot of ways. In fact, we did too good because we made a major acquisition, $750 million, and bought 5 or 6, I forget now, major market television stations. That was such a well-received acquisition that we became a hostile takeover target. And that was the end of the company.
Yeah. Well, it almost happened to Disney, and it did happen to Filmation. Same thing. Tom Cito described that not long ago, which is really sad.
We couldn't fight back because it was the Lindner family in Cincinnati and the Bass family in Texas. And they both wanted Taft. And the result was that they sort of got into a bidding war with themselves, and we just couldn't compete in a financial way. But it worked out. I think most, if not all, of our properties are still around in some form.
I wanted to ask you about Ruby Spears. There's a confusion now because when they reissue some of the cartoon series on video, they'll put Hanna Barbera collection, but it was really Ruby Spears. They were a separate company, and then they were like sister companies. How did that work?
We just had an opportunity to buy Ruby Spears and thought it would be an adjunct to the rest of the company. So it was that simple. We liked Ruby Spears, and we thought they were good, and it was just a simple acquisition.
Were the two combined, or did they still exist separately?
As I recall, they were separate.
Because the Taft way of doing things was let people who know what they're doing do what they do.
Exactly. And I think to have tried to merge Ruby Spears and Hanna-Barbera would have been a mistake for both of companies.
Yeah, well, Ruby and Spears, actually, those of you who want to know about that, stewshow.com has a huge archive of shows, and they were actually interviewed and talked about that. They started out as editors, and then they became instrumental in developing shows like Scooby-Doo, Dynamite, and then worked for ABC, did an enormous amount.
I have very pleasant memories of Ruby Spears. Do they still exist?
Well, I think that all fell under Ted Turner and under Warner. I think Warner owns all of it, and then we lost both of them, sadly, not all that long ago.
Really? Okay.
And people who worked there, they loved working for those guys. They were great guys.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. I remember that very well.
So I guess then it was Great America that had purchased, was that what it was, that took over Taft?
As I mentioned earlier, the Lindner family and the Bass family competed, and when they finally finished, they each took part of Taft. They divided it up in ways that I was not part of, obviously. Although I did suggest that maybe the most important piece of Taft was Hanna Barbera.
That's an important point, too. And that's a point we try to make here a lot, was just what a foundation Hanna Barbera was for the industry and for theme parks.
Yeah.
And for the development of animation on television and just entertainment in general.
Man, Hanna Barbera dominated Saturday morning television. At one point, if I remember right, we had something like 80%, or maybe it was 90% of Saturday morning animation.
Yeah, and very often one network would compete with another network with Hanna Barbera shows.
Absolutely. Joe was just a brilliant, not only animator, but salesman. Probably the biggest moneymaker, other than our broadcast properties that we owned, was World Vision, the distribution company.
Yes.
And that was a big moneymaker for us.
Yeah, you still see that occasionally on the end of Hanna Barbera cartoons. And
that's right.
That was the original imprint on the VHSs when they came out. Yeah.
Right.
And that was Taft as well.
Correct.
And also, because I used to read broadcasting magazines to see all the cool ads, World Vision was distributing their shows all over the world.
They really were, and they were the best. It was a very competitive industry, but we did quite well.
This is something also, I don't know if this was in your area or not, but now that they're rerunning a lot of the Hanna-Barbera shows on MeTV Tunes, a lot of people are struck by how some of the series have so few episodes, but that's how networks bought in those days.
Yeah.
The budgets were super low for daytime, so they would buy 16 or 17, and then they'd rerun them like 6 times. When you were distributing and syndicating them, I noticed that they were often put into packages, maybe 5 shows together, things like that.
Right.
Was that successful for you?
Yes, it was, because everything World Vision did, frankly, was successful. Kevin O'Sullivan was the head of it, and he was brilliant and tough, and he turned World Vision into a major asset of Taft's.
And gosh, I still see the W. I can see the W in my head now, that little logo. So what was life like after Taft for you?
I've had a strange career, I guess. I served for 5 years as the commissioner of the LPGA, Ladies Professional Golf Association.
Mm-hmm. Did you know Dinah Shore?
Very well, very well. We were really good friends, and she came to Cincinnati a couple of times at my request to do shows and so on. We played a lot of golf together. I knew her well. When I served as the LPGA commissioner, in my last tournament, I ran into Arnold Palmer, who's an old friend of mine, and he said, "What are you doing next?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm thinking about things." He said, "Let's have a beer after my round." Well, if Arnold Palmer asked you to have a beer, you had a beer. So
I'm just wondering why you didn't order Arnold Palmer's.
Oh, always. I'll even tell you how it happened. He was in a restaurant at a golf course one time where he played in an event, and the waitress said, "Sir, what were you having?" And he said, "Oh, just mix a lemonade and iced tea." So the waiter went to the next table and asked the lady what she'd have. She said, "I think I'll have that Arnold Palmer." That's how the names got started.
No kidding.
But he wanted me to become his consultant and advisor, and I did that. Shared his office at Bay Hill for 10 years, and we became very close friends, and even had homes next door to one another out in La Quinta at his course out there. So I've had like 5 careers, if you want to count them.
Wow. You mentioned Bay Hill. Are you speaking of the Bay Hill in the Orlando area?
Yes.
Wow.
That's where his office was. He had 2 offices, really. He had his home office in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and then he had his winter office at Bay Hill in Orlando.
There was a Walt Disney World tournament for years.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So that was a stomping ground, too. You were very familiar with what Walt Disney World had as a theme park person.
Absolutely.
As somebody who really knows the inner workings of how you do a quality theme park and resort complex, what were your impressions of Walt Disney World?
Oh, I was overwhelmed. It was just brilliant. You know, that's why I went to see Mr. Disney. I wanted to pick his brain, and boy, he was so gracious.
Even though Walt Disney World opened and Roy was there at the dedication, he didn't live much longer than that. But Walt Disney World really was, a brother helping a brother and getting a dream put together that didn't seem possible when Walt passed. And from what I've read it was in Jimmy Johnson's book, who was the head of the record company, he said that Roy opened it almost kind of debt-free using debentures.
He did, and he was very proud of the fact that he was the money guy. He didn't say this, but it surrounded all of his comments that he was the money guy because didn't know how to spend money.
Well, I guess the word is parsimonious.
Well, I think that's probably right.
He did have to put the brakes on Walt here and there because.
Oh yeah, and he was very nice about that.
And then again, as somebody who knows the finances, Walt Disney World is a tremendous profit center to this day for Disney.
Oh yeah, always will be, I think.
That is an international destination as well as a domestic one.
Well, it is, and I might tell you this, kind of an interesting aside, I think. Before we built Kings Island, we were strictly in radio and television. And so we were followed by Wall Street analysts who were broadcast analysts. And when I announced that we're going into the theme park business, I got about a dozen calls in an hour saying, "What are you doing? You're a broadcast company. Why are you getting in the theme park business?" I said, just stay tuned. But I got beat up pretty good in the beginning. And eventually, Kings Island began to show the wisdom of not my, but our move.
It seems like a lot of the story of this partnership is a long-range one, just like the Kings Island one, rather than a short-term gain. Okay, we're going to be behind a little bit, but in the long run, yeah, we're crazy, but just crazy enough to win.
Well, exactly. And what I explained to the analysts, and over time they understood it, the theme park business is a good business. It's a good cash flow business. I would say to these guys, how many businesses do you know where you got your clients' money before you even entered the park? It became very, very profitable for Taft.
Well, all of the proof is in the theme park, and the legacy of both Hanna Barbera and of Taft continues to prove itself. And I would imagine that's among the things you're proudest of.
It really is, because once we bought Hanna Barbera, I immediately began to think about how can you maximize the value of the Hanna Barbera characters. Now, well, there's no better roadmap than Disney, and that's why I went to see Mr. Disney. I'm sitting here looking on my wall at a little statuette of Quick Draw McGraw. The reason that happened is that Forbes magazine once wrote an article about me, and it was very favorable, but at the end they said, but Charlie is a bit of a gunslinger. And they meant it as a compliment, and I took it as a compliment. So my theme park division came up with this little statue of Quick Draw McGraw, Charlie the Gunslinger.
That's a good analogy for somebody, again, who takes risks and moves forward, in that you've always got the Dalton gang coming to tell you no, and you can't do this. And the Wild West of any new enterprise or any new format or anything, that is a Wild West. So I can kind of see Quick Draw.
I'll tell you one of my favorite memories. Our major stockholder was David Ingalls, an old pal, much older than I. He was a rear admiral in the Navy, and just quite an interesting gentleman. He was chairman of our board when I first came into the company, and I was extolling the virtues of Kings Island while it was being built. Mm-hmm. And when I finished, Mr. Ingalls said, "Charlie," he said, "as far as I can tell, the only thing you've proven so far is you know how to spend money." And I said, "I plead guilty."
I would imagine you and your colleagues at Taft always saw the value of not only the new thing that had to keep things running, got to always make new stuff to keep people working and all, but also the constant value of the back catalog that keeps on giving.
Yes, and our fundamental business was and still is broadcasting, because it's a cash cow.
Yeah, and all that material sitting there, and
Yeah,
it can continue to maximize profits, as you say.
exactly right. Now, the broadcasting business, even with the theme parks doing well, the broadcast business was a strong part of our company, always.
Well, Charlie, it's been a pleasure talking to
Thank
you.
you.
This is really, really exciting history that you brought to life for us, so I'm very, very grateful that you took the time. It's a great legacy, and it's been a great pleasure to speak with you. I thank you.
I could talk about Bill and Joe, Ewo, and the other people there forever.
What a great group of people. Well, it sounds
Yeah,
like
well,
Taft was too.
It was one of the nicest things. I was walking to downtown Cincinnati, and I ran into a friend of mine, and we had a nice visit. And he said, "Do you know, Charlie, that everyone wants to work for your company?" And I never forgot that because it meant so much to me. I assume it was true, but it said a lot about the culture that we had. I've been blessed, and here I am, 95, still talking.
You sound younger than me.
I'm not sure I'm younger than anybody, but I feel good. You know, what I say to people, people say, "How are you?" And I say, "Physically, I'm fine. Mentally, you should probably ask somebody else." But I think I'm going to hang on.
That's the thing, is the great memories and the good times and the era that you were blessed to be part of, that's all a gift.
It was a great time.
Well, we're delighted to have learned so much and to spend some time with you, and so I want to thank you again, and also thank your daughter again, because she made this all happen.
I'll tell her right away.
And I also want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you all for subscribing. People have said nice things, and this is just a joy to do, and it's been a joy. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the fantastic world of Hanna and Barbera with Greg Ehrbar. Please join us again, and many thanks for listening.